tensions between the US and Iran continue to escalate. Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton, and John Bolton's mustache have been working around the clock to provoke some sort of confrontation with Iran. Last year, Trump hired longtime neocon and war criminal John Bolton to be his national security advisor. A month later, the Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration finalized in 2015. Now, right there, that should have just shot up red flags to anyone who pays attention to US politics and foreign policy, because that move right there signals that you're looking for some type of military confrontation with Iran. Because one, hiring John Bolton alone kind of confirms that, because his entire career, he has pushed for war with Iran, whether he's in power or whether he's out of power. One of his main goals. And he said it, that his biggest regret in his career was not invading Iran at the same time we invaded Iraq in 2003. And then to go and pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, a peace agreement between the US and Iran a month after you hire John Bolton, well, the debate is over. We all, from that point, knew what direction that this was going in. And as much as I criticize Barack Obama, especially on foreign policy, the deal that he got with Iran was basically as good as it gets. In DC, there are these factually inaccurate but extremely pervasive narratives. The first is that Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, and the other is that Iran has been trying to build a nuclear weapon to use on the US or one of our allies. The first narrative about them being the #1 sponsor of state terrorism is wrong, because just objectively, the US and Saudi Arabia fund and prop up terrorism more than any other country in the world. On a regular basis, we hand over weapons intentionally and sometimes unintentionally to terrorist groups around the world. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. And if you want to go a little further back, the Mujahideen. And if you want to get outside of the Middle East, we can talk about giving weapons to the Contra rebels, which was a terrorist group in Nicaragua. Or the fact that we armed terrorists in Ecuador and in Guatemala. Official US government investigations found that 15 out of the 19 9/11 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, as well as the majority of the funding for the 9/11 attacks came from Saudi Arabia and people in high levels of the Saudi government. And that's just what I got off the top of my head. So again, everyone in DC conveniently ignores all of those facts and unanimously agrees that somehow Iran is still the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. Further proof that that idea is nonsense is that the terrorist groups that we accuse Iran of funding are fundamentally ideologically opposed to the Iranian government. Most, if not all, of the jihadist terrorist organizations, which are the most prominent and violent of all terrorist groups, are Salafist, Wahhabist, Sunni Muslims. Iran is almost entirely Shia Muslim. Those terrorist groups who we accuse Iran of funding literally are on the record saying that they want to kill all Shia Muslims and they want to destroy Iran. The people that these jihadists target more than any other group, more than Christians or any other religion, are Shia Muslims. Even though here in the US we like to fearmonger and pretend like ISIS is coming after us and they're going to be here any second, the reality is the group of people who ISIS poses the biggest threat to are Shia Muslims. So it's just bonkers and backwards to believe that Iran, which is considered to be a Shia stronghold in the Middle East, would be funding and propping up jihadists whose main goal is to slaughter Shia Muslims and allies of Iran. But the other narrative pervasive in the establishment that has caused the most tension between the US and Iran, especially in recent years, is the idea that they are trying to build a nuclear weapon to attack the US or one of our allies. Again, this is something that a minimal amount of research and understanding of geopolitics would lead you to conclude that this is just another one of those made-up narratives to justify aggression towards a country that the US considers public enemy #1. First of all, no one ever has proven that Iran was trying to build a nuclear weapon, at least not in recent years, that I know of. At best, all of this is based off of innuendo from the intelligence agencies like the CIA, who we know don't have a track record of being honest and trustworthy anywhere, really, but definitely not in Iran. We know that the CIA did a coup in the 1950s to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh just to keep Iran from nationalizing the oil, and so that US and Western corporations can continue to basically rob Iran for their natural resources. So when the CIA says, ooh, look out, Iran's building a nuclear weapon and we should all be very scared and we need to do something about it, I have a hard time believing them, because I know the lengths that they will go to facilitate regime change in Iran. Unfortunately, most politicians in the US don't share my sensibilities and don't share my skepticism of the intelligence community. So when the CIA says Iran is building a nuke to attack the US or one of our allies, they believe that shit. Furthermore, follow me through this hypothetical real quick. Let's say Iran did have a nuke. What evidence is there that they would have used it on anyone? Because if they did, it would guarantee that they'd be nuked right back and their country would be destroyed. So it's a similar dynamic that exists with North Korea. Yeah, North Korea has nuclear weapons, but there's no chance that they're going to use them offensively, because that's guaranteed destruction and the death of Kim Jong-un. So as brutal of a tyrant as he doesn't have a death wish. So this fear of Iran, one, funding terrorists to attack the US, and two, developing a nuclear weapon to use against the US or one of our allies, is so many layers removed from reality. It's hard to believe that adults actually take this propaganda seriously. So even though I thought the scenario about Iran building a nuclear weapon was nonsensical, I still agree with and support Barack Obama doing this nuclear deal with Iran for several different reasons. The first, it lifted sanctions that the US and other countries had imposed on Iran, which was crippling the economy. And as usual, the way sanctions work is they end up hurting the poorest and the most vulnerable people in the country. Also, the deal had very strict requirements about how much nuclear energy Iran can develop for other purposes like medical treatments and for power for their electric grid and other things like that. Because under international law, it is illegal to just say a country cannot use any nuclear power, because for a lot of countries, that is their only source of energy, and it's also used for medical treatments. And Iran was forced to disclose all of their nuclear enrichment sites, and they had to allow international inspectors from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, into the country to verify that they weren't enriching uranium past the point where they're supposed to the point where they could use it for a nuclear weapon. And this was extremely important for myself and progressives and other anti-war voices, because for the longest time, neocons have been using the threat of Iran and a nuclear weapon as justification for why the US should invade Iran and start a gigantic war and debacle. And there had been some times, especially under the Bush administration, where it seemed like a war with Iran was inevitable. So this nuclear deal and allowing international inspectors to monitor the nuclear program, that completely takes that justification off the table, because as has been shown since the deal was agreed to, Iran has been in compliance with international law and the agreement. They have not been working to build a nuclear weapon. And that has been verified by independent international inspectors from the IAEA. So if the CIA and the neocons were trying to gin up support for some type of invasion of Iran under the pretext that they were about to hit the US with a nuke, all we would have to do is go to the multiple inspections and verifications from the IAEA and immediately debunk their bullshit. And another thing that was good about this deal was it cost the US absolutely nothing. We made no concessions in this deal. There was no skin off of our back. So understand something. For all the people in Washington who claim to be so scared and so afraid of Iran having a nuclear weapon, this deal that Obama struck was the absolute best case scenario. It was the best deal that the US could get with Iran to prevent them from ever getting a nuke. But of course, for the warmongers in the US, that wasn't enough. The warmongers in both parties opposed it. So I'm talking about Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. I think Hillary Clinton opposed the Iran nuclear deal too. But especially the neocons and the Republican Party. They made it clear from before the deal was even signed that if a Republican president was to get into the White House, they would immediately rip up the Iran nuclear deal. And that right there exposes their true intentions. Because like I laid out, this was the absolute best case scenario. The Republicans and the neocons don't actually want some type of peace between the US and Iran. They want regime change, and they want a US puppet in control of the country and the oil supply. They've been clear about this for decades. So when Donald Trump comes into office with absolutely no understanding of foreign policy, he basically defers all decisions when it comes to foreign policy to the neocons in his administration, like Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton. And they have taken this opportunity to do exactly what they've wanted to do for decades, which is push for regime change in Iran. A month after John Bolton got hired, he pulls the US out of the Iran nuclear deal and pushes for more sanctions on Iran. Sanctions which have created a humanitarian crisis in the country by making it harder for them to export oil, which is their main source of income. And it's also made it harder for them to import medical supplies and food into the country. But that wasn't an accident. That was John Bolton and Mike Pompeo's intention the entire time. It's a similar strategy to what they're doing in Venezuela. They want to cripple the economy and create unrest to the point where groups within the country decide to overthrow the government, which would allow the US to install a puppet dictator amongst the chaos. Or we cripple the economy to the point where it becomes easier for us to just overtly do a coup, whether it's with the CIA or just a military intervention. And again, we would then install our own puppet to control the country, and mostly the oil supply. So since Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal and put sanctions on Iran, tensions have just continued to escalate. On Wednesday, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani announced that in 60 days he would be pulling out of certain parts of the agreement in retaliation for the US sanctions if European countries go along with the US and enforce those sanctions. Trump responded by placing even more sanctions on Iran, but this time on steel exports. So we're going after the oil, which is their number one export, and now we're going after the steel. And then again, this is an attempt to take their economy out at its knees and to create instability in the country. I don't like the direction the standoff appears to be going. This regime change effort being led by John Bolton is extremely concerning. It's not an exaggeration when I say that John Bolton is one of the most dangerous men in America. If there's one thing John Bolton is efficient and effective at doing, it is starting illegal, unnecessary, destructive wars. He was one of the chief architects for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the biggest blunders in US foreign policy history. Millions of dead civilians, both countries in fucking chaos. We're still there to this day. We went in Iraq in 2003 and we went in Afghanistan in 2001, the longest wars in US history. The man has the blood of millions of civilians on his hands, as well as thousands of US troops, and he still is desperate to start more wars around the world. And it would be one thing if he was writing his shitty New York Times op-eds, or if he was consulting at think tanks, or he was lobbying for the defense industry. That would be bad enough. But John Bolton has found himself in a unique position where he almost gets to operate unilaterally when it comes to US foreign policy. He's the national security advisor to the President of the United States, the highest ranking national security official in the White House. He's in charge of the National Security Council. Donald Trump isn't paying attention to anything enough to challenge any of John Bolton's cockamamie theories and rationalizations to go to war. There have been multiple reports that Donald Trump has his national security briefings condensed to one page. The entire national security briefing down to one page. He does not give a fuck about anything. Whatever John Bolton tells him, he will go with. And furthermore, there isn't even a defense secretary to provide some pushback to John Bolton, because since Mattis left and took all his people, there's only been an acting secretary of defense at the Pentagon. And yes, I understand that Mattis is a warmonger and a war criminal too, and at times he does have a hard-on for Iran. But at least there was a slight hope that maybe there's a chance that he could act as some sort of buffer between John Bolton and an all-out war in Iran. Because the way it looks right now, John Bolton is going full steam ahead on regime change in Iran, and there isn't anybody stopping this train. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, is all on board. Mike Pence, the Vice President, is all on board. And Donald Trump, the fucking idiot, man-child, buffoon, is all on board. I said it as soon as John Bolton got hired and brought into the White House. Everybody look out, because this man is not going to find himself back in the White House with even more power than before and not start some kind of disastrous war, mainly with Iran. Because, like I mentioned before, even he says that his biggest regret in his career was that he didn't invade Iran at the same time he invaded Iraq. So buckle up, because shit looks like it's about to get crazy. I'll be following this story for updates, but right now it is not looking good.